Now for today's program. Qian Julie Wang is the New York Times best-selling author of Beautiful Country, a memoir of an undocumented childhood, which was named a best book of 2021 by the New York Times, President Obama, NPR, Newsweek, Good Housekeeping, and more. A graduate of Yale Law School and Swarthmore College, Qian Julie is managing partner of Gottlieb and Wang, a firm dedicated to advancing educational civil rights for marginalized populations. Her writing has been published in major publications such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, and she has appeared on the Today Show, ABC News, and NPR, among others. Qian Julie lives in Brooklyn with her husband and their 2 rescue dogs, Salt and Peppers. Joining Qian Julie today is Moment editor Sarah Breger. Sarah is also the director of Moment's Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative. Sarah has won numerous awards, including first place for Religion Reporting of the Year from the Religion News Association, and first place for Best In-Depth News Writing on Religion from the American Academy of Religion. Please welcome Qian Julie Wang and Sarah Breger.
Qian Julie, I just finished your book actually over the weekend, and it's so beautifully written. And I was surprised to learn when I read that you actually wrote it on the subway as you were going, back to and from your job when you were working in corporate law. I was curious, what prompted you to decide that now is the time to tell your story?
Shana Tova, I'm so happy to be here with everyone. That is a great question. I think in many ways, this book and story lived inside me all of my life. When I first moved here in 1994 and I didn't speak any English, I threw myself into the libraries trying to gobble up the language as quickly as I could so I could develop fluency and throw off any suspicion about my immigration status. And in that process, I fell in love with books and stories. But back in the 90s, there were very few books about people like me, about families like mine. And I remember turning to my mother one day and saying, "Why aren't we anywhere on the shelves?" And she told me then, and repeated it whenever I needed to hear it, that I would be someone who could put some of those stories out there. So that kind of planted the seed. But of course, then I became very focused on doing the job that paid the rent and paid off loans, and got a little bit swept away into that until finally in 2016, I became a naturalized citizen. And it's really odd to have something that you dream about for over 2 decades actually happen. It's surreal, and you don't think it's quite actually going to happen. And when it did, and I was fortunate to have, at the time, a video of President Obama at the naturalization ceremony greeting us and calling all of us fellow Americans. When I heard those words, something just came unearthed in me. It brought me back to those years, to that time that I was that little girl at the library, dreaming of big things, dreaming of telling my story, telling the story not just for me, but for my whole community, to the world. And finally, I think I had safety to recognize that little girl and to let her crawl out of me. I had buried her for so many years. And of course, then the political rhetoric of the election later that year reminded me that I was now a citizen, and I had the distinct privilege of being shielded from deportation or interrogation by immigration authorities, a privilege that many millions of Americans who spent most of their lives here may never see. And so that secret of mine that I had harbored for so many years was no longer mine to keep. It was my duty and my responsibility to share a little bit of the humanity that is the undocumented community.
It's interesting you mentioned secrets, because I think throughout the book, there's this refrain that I think maybe your father tells you: whatever happens, say that you were born here. They've always lived here. I'm curious how your parents changed when they came to the United States, and if, and what role secrecy played in that.
Yeah, the shift was both overnight and very gradual. In China, my father was pretty rebellious. I mean, he came from a dissident family. He had seen his eldest brother persecuted and imprisoned and tortured for something he wrote about the government. And he hated that kind of authoritarianism with a passion and had a hard time keeping it a secret. And so I had only known my father for the first part of my life as this really outspoken, strident, passionate person who would not go against his principles and his beliefs. And when I was reunited with him after his first 2 years in America, I describe it in the book as feeling like he was smaller somehow, like he had been chipped away, that there was something in his eyes and in his soul that was no longer there. And over time, it became clear to me that this need to keep this secret, again, a secret that hit very close to the heart of his childhood traumas, which was being from a dissident background, being illegitimate, but now in America, just being thought of as unacceptable, unwanted, impermissible. The secret that became the core of his identity, it started to wear away a lot of that rebellious spirit that he had developed over the years of seeing his family persecuted. I think it brought back a little bit too much of what he saw. And as I've gotten older, I've started to understand even more what it must have been like for him to feel, I was born into this unwanted status. I fought my way out of it. I fought my way to the other side of the world. And yet here I am again in this unwanted status. And it got me thinking too, as I learned to appreciate the many sides of my father that I could not see as a child, what secrecy does to all of us, right? We all have these secrets that we learn to guard and hide for most, if not all, of our lives. What secrets tell us at their very core is that there's something to be ashamed of. And specifically, there's something to be ashamed of about who we are. And very few of us make it through childhood and into adulthood without learning that shame. And I think as I've gotten older, that perhaps it's a chief mission of an adult to unwind ourselves from that shame, to separate our identity and our truest self, who we naturally were as children, from that shame that was imposed upon us in society, and that keeps us quiet, keeps our head down, keeps us doubting ourselves. And I am so privileged to have been able to see and learn both sides from my father, and that he had sacrificed so much of who he was to give me that opportunity.
It seemed that even though, your father faced so much ugliness in a way, in America, he still, loved the country. Whereas your mom, you sort of saw she became a little disillusioned. Why do you think he maintained this love for America despite everything he faced?
It is present tense for him. He, to this day, is the absolute biggest patriot I know. I asked him recently if he were to do it all again, whether he would. And he said maybe there were small things I would have changed, but America, I would come back to America 1,001 lifetimes. This is the place of equality and democracy. And I think that vision of America, I think to be an immigrant who chooses a land, you have to have that passion. You have to feel like you chose your new homeland, even if what you find here is not necessarily welcoming and does not necessarily line up with what you envision. But I think for my father, that idea of America being tied with justice and equality and opportunity is very much connected to what he read as a child. When my uncle was thrown into prison, he left behind a collection of banned books from America and from England in the floorboards of their home. And only my father knew where they were because he had seen his brother kind of smuggle them out in the middle of the night to read them. So when he missed his brother the most, he would open up those floorboards at night by candlelight and read the words of Hemingway and Mark Twain and imagine a land where it was possible to write so openly and freely in criticism of the government and criticism of society. And I think many of us who can probably now think of the books that were nearest and dearest to our hearts as children know that that which we read that early in life becomes forever a part of us. Those visions become core principles of our beliefs and the way that we believe the world should be. And I think that that has what has endeared my father so impermeably to the United States. I am sad that I cannot be as rosy about our home as he is, but again, that is a privilege, right? Because I am able to see a little bit more clearly what America is. I love it fervently, and it is forever my home as well. But I believe it was also Mark Twain who said to love a country is to criticize it because you believe that it can do better. And so, yeah, my love for America comes from the ardent passion that my father feels for it.
That kind of relates a little bit to the title of your book, Beautiful Country, which seems to have many layers, maybe a little bit of irony to it as well. Could you talk a little bit about why you decided to call your book Beautiful Country?
Yeah, I had a working title for the manuscript for the longest time. I mean, for most of it, I had no title because I told myself, you're never going to finish this book. It's never going to see the light of day. There was no point putting a title on it. And once it came time to choose a title, my agent and I went back and separately came up with potential names for the book. And Beautiful Country was the one that appeared on both of our lists. And once we put it on the book, it felt like there was no other title that could have worked. Because, I think a lot of people know Beautiful Country is a direct translation of the Chinese word for America, which is Meiguo. But more than that, it symbolizes both what America holds itself out as on the international stage, all of the ideals that the United States was founded upon and works toward. And at the same time, I think highlights all the ways in which this country is not so beautiful. Those ideals have yet to be realized and remain ideals and not reality. And the many truths of what immigrants see when they land here, which is that is not exactly the welcoming refuge that the plaque on the Statue of Liberty would suggest that it might be.
I think for a lot of our Jewish readers, your immigration story and the immigration story and their knowledge of sweatshops really kind of focuses on the 19th and early 20th century, and then perhaps stops there. I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about your experience working in sweatshops in the 90s.
I get this feedback a lot, like, oh, we didn't know that there were sweatshops at all. And of course, I didn't know a New York without sweatshops. So my reality was very different. It is the memories that I have of that room remain visceral. I remember walking in, and it was a room that was quite sizable, and yet it felt like there was no air in it. All of the windows were covered. It smelled like a mix of sweat and rice. There were bugs. And then there were just rows and rows of people hunched over, working, it seemed, endlessly at their machines. And as I write in the book, in that room, there was no night or day. It was the articles before you and the articles to come. And that was all that mattered. And once you kind of slipped into the work at your machine or at your station, it almost felt like you became one of the cogs of that system. And in many ways, it hurt more to stop than to keep going. I talk about in the specific chapter about the sweatshop where the minute I actually sat straight, stood up, I felt this shooting pain just up and down my back because I had been curled up like that, not even aware of my posture, for anywhere from 8 to 12, 14 hours. But I think in that sweatshop too, there was a sense of agency and hope, because there your survival and your means of living were very tangible, right? If you could get through 10 articles of clothing at the rate that I was being paid, that was 10 cents. And so you could measure out in your day just exactly how well you wanted to survive, how much food you could put on the table, and pace yourself. And when you are in an existence where there's very little agency and very little control, that kind of tangible accountability actually meant a lot. It gave you a sense of hope. And I think that that kind of immigrant mentality probably stays with me to this day. I can't quite stay still. I have to keep moving. There seems to be this continued lingering sense that if I stop whatever it is I'm doing, that I will not survive. That experience of being reduced to less than human, to being a clothing producing machine, I think is still somewhere deep in the core of me. And if anyone is curious about the sweatshops, the Tenement Museum in New York City has recreated apartments and rooms from different eras of New York. I don't know if the exhibit they have for the sweatshop is specifically based in the 1990s, but when I went in there, I did an event there last fall, and when I went in, I was shocked. I was like, how did you recreate this? And there were other visitors in there with me, museum visitors, and I actually felt offended. I was like, how dare you all be in there? This is my office. This is where I worked. As a child, there was a station for the free rice, just like I had experienced. Every little detail was just a facet of my living memory. So it is really authentic. It's quite possible that the sweatshops just did not change that much over the years, and that's why that could be so relevant across time. But being in that exhibit brought forth all the more the ways in which that experience still lives on inside me.
And I think it's important to note for maybe some of the people here who haven't read the book that, we're talking about when you were, 7 years old and doing all this, between 7 and 12. So it's sort of amazing all the work you were expected to do as a child.
Yeah, I think I was fortunate in that I had a mother who made everything a game. Like, I would watch her cook in the kitchen when I was 5, and she'd be peeling the cucumbers. I'd be like, what are you doing? She's like, oh, I'm just, scrubbing them clean. And so there was a way in which she turned every chore or task into a game. And so for me, it wasn't so much that I was working. I was like, oh, it's a cool perk that I get a penny per article of clothing. This is a hide and seek game that I'm playing. So my job was to cut off loose threads from the pieces of clothing. And my mom's job was to put labels onto her articles of clothing, for which she got 3 cents a piece. And so in my mind, I was playing hide and seek with the thread, and it was just my job to find them all. And that kind of mentality that my mother was able to create and build for me really shielded me a lot from the reality of it. And it wasn't until much later that it clicked into place what I was actually doing and how much worse it could have been if I had been fully aware. But I think some of that also is attributable to the wonders of childhood, where children should just kind of accept what's coming to them, and they find a way to make it fun or make it fanciful. And it's the adult editorializing that adds a lot of pain and hardship to those early memories.
And your book, which covers the 5 years when you were 7 to 12, really touches on the magic of childhood in a way. And even though it's specific to you, I think it still feels, as I was reading it, I was thinking about when I was a kid and how your world is both so small and so big at the same time. How did you, tap into those emotions and write from the viewpoint of a child?
I wrote in the voice that came most authentically to me. When I started working on this book, I didn't have a set idea on what the voice would be. What I wanted most of all was for readers to open the book and feel like they were stepping into my body and seeing things as I saw them and experiencing things and as I experienced them, which included things that didn't make any sense to me at the time. I just wanted this book to be a transporting vehicle. And the best way I could render that experience was to close my eyes and travel back in time into that little body. And I was lucky in that I had kept a very detailed and copious diary where I scribbled down a lot of mundane details of the day. I was really admired Harriet the Spy and wanted to be myself a spy, so I wrote down a lot of details. And it's interesting because it wasn't that little girl is necessarily honest in the diary. A lot of us probably aren't fully honest in our diaries. It was the details that she focused on. Like, I remember one entry where that little girl wrote 5 pages on the strawberry shortcake popsicle that her classmate ate every day, and the pink and red dots that were on it. Like, so many pink and red dots, like little pom-poms, just so detailed. Like, I knew exactly what that popsicle looked like, but I didn't know how it tasted. And it just got me thinking, reading pages like that, what could have possibly motivated me to be that fixated on that popsicle? Oh yeah, I was really hungry. I felt really deprived. I really wanted to know what it tasted like and not what it looked like. And there were many, many pages like that kind of thankfully connected me to the little girl that I had buried really for most of my adult life. And I hope that I was able to render some of her experiences true and real for the readers out there.
At some point in the book, you talk about choosing the name Julie. And I think maybe a teacher that you didn't like at some point said something like, you either have to be Julie or you have to be Qian. You can't be both. In Judaism, there is a significance to choosing your own name. And I'm curious why you chose the name Julie, and if your thoughts about names have evolved or changed over the years.
I chose Julie because those who watch PBS Kids in the 90s know that there was a show called Puzzle Place. And it's a show that doesn't get enough love. I think it was so wonderful. Puzzle Place was a house where all these little puppets came to hang out after school. And it was so incredibly diverse. There was one puppet from every background and ethnicity, it felt like. And there was a Chinese girl puppet named Julie Wu. And she was one of the few Asian people who were, Asian characters who were on TV at the time. The other being I believe it was the Yellow Power Ranger. And I so envied Julie because she was able to go to that house and be herself. And she would often wear things or bring things that were significant to the Chinese culture. And I had, by that point, learned so much shame about being an immigrant, about being Chinese, that I didn't feel like I had the space to do that. But Julie was normal, and Julie didn't have a difficult name that made people trip up or misspell it or mispronounce it. And she was equal to all of her friends who were from different parts of the world. So I longed to be Julie. And I had hoped that if I could wear that name well, that I could camouflage, I could fit in, I could be just as accepted as Julie. And for a long time in my early adulthood and more recent adulthood, I only went by Julie, and I mispronounced my last name Wang as Wang. I'll go around being Julie Wang because that was the easiest for anyone to pronounce or wrap their mind around. And until one day I stood up in court and I said, Julie Wang, attorney for the plaintiff. And I thought, who am I to be here standing up, claiming to speak for my clients' truths, my clients' stories, when I can't even pronounce or say my full name? Like, what kind of a fraud am I? That I'm going back to my office and telling my client, no, you deserve your day in court and you deserve your truth to be heard. And I can't even open it with my own truth. And that sent me into a real examination of why I rejected Qian for so long. She was inconvenient. She couldn't be pronounced. She was not acceptable. She did not fit in. And then I thought, what was wrong with that? What was wrong with not fitting in? Why did I choose such a boring name? Right? There's nothing that interesting about Julie, and no offense to anyone out there named Julie or who chose it for themselves. Qian was unique and singular. There was, you Google my name, Qian Julie Wang, there's no one else out there with that name. And I wanted that again. I wanted to be able to stand up and not just say Julie, but that I was Qian too, and that I was embracing the self that I had rejected for so long, that little girl who was not convenient. And yeah, it then became a dilemma of, well, now who am I? And that teacher's voice rang through again. You have to be Qian or Julie, you can't be both. And I thought, why can't I be both? They are both now at this point part of my identity. Julie was the striver, the achiever, the one, the armor, the one who wanted to fit in and who was able to fit in for a time until she realized that that wasn't true to who she really was. And Qian was the younger self who was so wise and strong and able to be true to who she was in the center of her heart and her deepest sense of integrity. And I wanted to marry that identity, just like I marry the identity of being an Asian American, being Chinese and Jewish, being a lawyer and author. We are all multitudes. We are all myriad things. And the idea that we have to choose one facet of our personality, of our history to represent us, to my mind, was ridiculous. But I think this concept is still very foreign, and a lot of people are like, which name are you? And so I have to repeat it. But every time I have to repeat it and reassert it, maybe it's my dissident blood, I just believe it that much more. I need a little bit of resistance. And now I think about the time when I was just Qian or just Julie, and it doesn't seem like me. Like, I'm Qian Julie, and that's the fullest expression of my sense of self.
To switch gears, 2 years ago, I think it was, you gave a very moving Dvar Torah at Central Synagogue on Rosh Hashanah. And in it, you touched on the discrimination Jews of color face within the Jewish community. I think you actually gave a statistic that 80% of Jews of color say they've faced discrimination in the Jewish community themselves. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about your experiences as a Jew of color existing in, a predominantly white Ashkenazi Jewish communal framework.
Yeah, it's been a very long journey. My connection and discovery of my deep roots in Judaism. I grew up in New York. I was around Jewish influences and read Jewish books my whole life, and I didn't understand. I just thought my values were mine and they came from me, and not the brilliant works of Abraham Joshua Heschel and Anne Frank and everything that I read so early on that became a part of me. When I discovered that connection, it was mystical and magical, and I was so happy to come home. I was like, oh my God, I found my place. I've been here my whole life, and I just didn't know. And that illusion of homecoming was shattered a little bit time and time again when I would go to shul or go to Jewish spaces, and people just assumed that I knew nothing about Judaism, that I was not myself Jewish. And I would have to defend myself. Why are you here? Why are you Jewish? How are you Jewish? Oh, that's so cool. And there's almost this sense that I'm a tourist, right, in Jewish space. Like, let me show you around. This is what we do on Friday nights. And it's like, no, I've been here a lot. And it really sent me back to that place when I was a child and treated like an undocumented immigrant, a new immigrant who clearly did not belong. And belonging is that which I think all of us want most of all. And it made me really angry and made me question my faith, made me question whether I really was part of this community, especially in times when I would almost in a split second face both exclusion from the Jewish community and then anti-Semitism. I mean, there was this one example I had shared with you privately earlier. I was in a cab in Midtown Manhattan, and some of the members of the Chabad who, stop people on the street and say, are you Jewish? Are you Jewish? Which, by the way, Jews of color really want. The Ashkenazi Jews find it very annoying, but for us, it's an honor to be stopped. We text each other, we cheer when it happens. It only happened to me once when a little girl stopped me. So anyway, I was in this cab, and there's this guy just like knocking on windows of the car saying, are you Jewish? Are you Jewish? He knocks on every single window, including my cab driver who was white passing, except for mine. And when he knocked on my cab driver's window, my cab driver rolled down his window and he said, are you Jewish? And the cab driver was like, no, like kind of almost like offended. And the person keeps walking, knocking on the passenger window next to me, but not mine, and just passes me by. And I just feel so deeply unwanted and excluded. And then the cab driver turns around, looks at me, and he's like, these people, right? In disgust. And I don't know if he means, just general solicitations on the street, or he means Jews. I felt like it was anti-Semitism. And I was so taken aback by that whiplash of both someone in the community saying, I'm not Jewish, there's no way I could be Jewish, and someone being like, oh, these disgusting people. I was paralyzed in that moment of this deep sense of loyalty and commitment to my faith and my community, and also this utter rejection that I was frozen. I didn't know what to do. And to this day, I think back and I'm like, wow, how could I not have said something, right? It's not like me to not say something. But in that moment, I was like, well, you don't want me. I don't want you either. And I think this is a struggle with faith that is perhaps in many ways unique to Jews of color in America. But it was Rabbi Heschel who wrote that faith can be a cornerstone of, a doubt can be a cornerstone of faith. And if you doubt, but you still believe, that means that your faith and your connection to God and spirituality is that much stronger. And it is a tension that I continue to have when I see how baked in some of these implicit bias and prejudices are in the American Jewish communities. I think it is changing. I'm seeing a lot of faith leaders tackling it. I'm seeing a lot of members of the Jews of color community tackling it, but I think we have a long ways to go. I think it's simply unacceptable for 80% of Jews of color to feel unwanted in Jewish spaces. We are all one. We are all part of the same family, the same tribe, and there's enough people outside our community attempting to divide us that we don't need to further that divide within.
One thing I think when we were talking earlier, is you also mentioned a trip to Israel and how it was ultimately more disappointing than you thought it would be. Could you talk a little bit about that and what it was like to go to Israel as a Jew of color?
Yeah, very much the same as me thinking, oh, I'm coming home. This is going to be a magical experience. And that illusion was shattered before I even got on the plane. We flew the Israeli airline, and I was with Ashkenazi Jews, and I was the only one who was separated out by the airline and questioned and interrogated, and people who were traveling with me were questioned and interrogated about how they knew me and why would I want to go to Israel? What intent did I have to go there? I wasn't even allowed. This was before I even checked my bags. And so at that point, I was like, do I still want to go? Well, clearly, I'm not wanted. I don't know what lies ahead, but this does not bode well. But I was hopeful. I was hopeful that once I actually got to Israel, it would be different. I was in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and unfortunately, the treatment was much the same. I was stared at. I was stopped. People said konnichiwa to me on the street. I was praying at the wall, and it's segregated by gender. And as I was walking out from the well after prayer, which was a magical and special moment for me, someone stopped me and said, "Konnichiwa, where are you from?" And I'm like, this is a holy place. I don't understand why I need to be reminded of my race here, of all places. And upon my return from Israel, I was again very upset and very conflicted over my connection to this community. There have been many times when I said, I just need a break. I can't do this. Because before I went there, I had only been told to expect beautiful things, magical things, a place where we finally belonged. Most of this messaging came from Ashkenazi Jews, but I didn't think of myself as being different, right? Until I was reminded of that. And so to have expected such welcome, such warmth, and to have found something so very, very different was earth-shattering to my faith. And it took me quite a while to recover from that. And I don't know when I'll be able to bring myself to go back there.
Are there ways you think the American, or how can the American Jewish community kind of do better in terms of embracing Jews of color?
There are many, many things. I think we're already kind of moving in the right direction. But one key point is just to realize that Jews come in more shades and appearances than you might think. And that if you see one of us in a Jewish space, is probably because we are Jewish and we know what we're doing and we're not lost, and we're not just gawking to learn new things, that perhaps we are and have been part of the community for far longer than you have been aware of. I will say that I think the pandemic actually helped me a lot, because for the first time I was able to go to services from home and not be worried about people saying something to me, and just be there to be myself and to connect with my faith and commune with God. And some of that experience from Zoom services, I've tried to carry with me when I go to in-person services. And I think it probably would behoove many of us to remember that when we go to services, we are there to pray, and it doesn't matter what we look like on the outside. That prayer, that spiritual connection is at the center of that occurrence, and to respect that space for everyone who is in that sanctuary with you should be the foremost of your mind. So yeah, just assume we're one of you.
I know we need to end to get to questions, but before we do, if there was one lesson you think you would want readers to get from your book, what would it be?
I wrote the book less as a message and lesson and more as an experience, like getting on board a train and seeing through my eyes probably some very familiar terrain, but also some new ones. And I think that if any single lesson were to be gleaned for that, it would be that we are all much more alike than we are different. That core of humanity, the hope and fear and joy and love and longing, is at the core of all of us in childhood. Is that magical, almost universal capsule where we all experience things like going around the world not knowing why there are certain rules, why adults are bossing us around, why we're told to keep things secret or be ashamed. That is a universal experience. And so when you peel back the layers of all of us, I think most adults would probably agree that we are that little kid at heart, and we just want to belong and love and connect. And when you're able to see things on that spiritual level, really, it is a spiritual way of seeing things. There's no one who is a stranger, which is a concept that I think many of us are familiar with. And I think that it can help guide us through a lot of difficult interactions, through ways of seeing politics, of ways engaging in the world, that we are, our armored adult selves might have a harder time reckoning with. So yeah, I'll often say, I hope that the wisdom and strength of our childhood selves guide us, because we were born into the world with everything we needed to know. And it is our job to kind of travel back there and find that connection and find that truth among all of us. That to me is true spirituality.
Thank you. I think Suzanne, I know, is going to jump on to ask some questions.
Yes.
Okay. Hi.
Thank you. Thank you thank you both very much. Qian Julie, thank you for continuing to share your story with us. I know I had the opportunity to listen to you reading your book, which is just so powerful to hear the story in your own voice. Have you been surprised by the response from people? And I know you talked about President Obama earlier, and to know that he has a big fan of your book and you sharing your story. What has that experience been like?
Utterly surreal. Most of the time I think I'm hallucinating. It's not actually happening. Especially the thing with President Obama, it was a real full circle moment, because those who have read my book knows that I open with the reason that I wrote this, and it was because I was being sworn into citizenship, and there had been an image of President Obama greeting all of us as American, and that kind of spurred me on to this idea of revisiting a time when I so longed to be American and was so denied that privilege. But the moments that have me most breathless, I think, are the times when young teens travel from far away to come to my book events, and they wait until the very end because they have a story they want to tell me that they don't want anyone else to be privy to. And inevitably they come up when the room has cleared and they've been waiting for hours, and they say, "I'm undocumented too." And I thought that I was the only one who struggled with these feelings, who wanted so badly to fit in. And your book made me feel less alone. And that to me is the biggest honor I could ever receive. I grew up loving so many books that, as I said, have become a deep part of me, part of my moral compass and my sense of self and my sense of the world. And to know that my book is doing that for the next generation, it humbles me to no end. I think they say that the deepest and most meaningful work you can do with your life is the work for the younger you, right? To heal the younger you. And I feel that I am doing that every day, because I go out there at book events and I'm privileged to meet so many brilliant, determined young children who are in the place that I was in, but have the foresight and the strength to say, no, I am worthy. I know that I am worthy, and I know that I will make a difference. And I too want to be a writer or lawyer or a speaker. And to know that little Qian traveled this far and has come all this way and sees herself now on the other side of that signing table, it is a privilege that I never could have imagined for myself.
Somebody would like to know, what was it like telling your parents that you were going to write a book, and what has their response been?
So I never told them I was going to write a book. I just wrote the book. I didn't tell them because I didn't think I would be able to finish it. And when I thought about how they would react to my putting a book out there, I just freaked out. I was like, they are not going to take this well. But the next sentence in my head was always, well, you're not going to finish it anyway, so it doesn't matter. It's a victimless crime that you're doing. You're just writing this for yourself. So when I did, lo and behold, finish the book and somehow managed to get a book deal, I was terrified. I put off telling them until the last possible minute. I remember because my husband was like, you have to tell them before they walk by a bookstore and see it. And that would not be a good way for them to find out. And I told them, and it was like a 5-act play where all three of us, for the first time in, I don't know, almost 3 decades, talked about those years And I didn't know how badly that was needed, because for all the time that we spent not talking about those years, we were reliving them. It was a wedge between all three of us, where each of us felt singularly guilty and responsible for the things that happened to the others. And I don't think this is unique to my family. I think every family has these topics that they just can't bring themselves to touch. And yet it is in that silence that so much weight is carried and born and bred. And once we were finally able to air it out, and we realized that each of us was only blaming ourselves and not the other, it felt like the path had cleared to building a future that was finally untethered to this heavy, weighty past. I'm not saying it was easy. I say it's a 5-act play because it took a very long time and there was a lot of screaming and crying. And my parents totally thought that I was writing some sort of manifesto that blamed them for everything that went awfully in my childhood. And I understand, because no parent wants their child to write a childhood memoir. I couldn't imagine being in that position. But I think once they read the book, they were able to feel some of the love and forgiveness that I wanted to send out to them and to all the parents out there in the world. And that, I think, in turn allowed them to let go a little bit more of the past for themselves.
Can you share anything at all about their journey over the last 20, 30 years? What are they doing today?
My mother endlessly reinvents herself. She's had a million jobs. There's nothing she couldn't do. If she told me tomorrow that she was opening a restaurant on Fifth Avenue, I would be like, okay, yeah, of course. That would be the next thing. She was a programmer for a very long time, started her own business doing some programming and consulting work, and then got into a little bit of holistic and Eastern medicine on the side of doing all of that. Became a real estate agent because she became really fascinated with houses and real estate, and then wrote just things for herself on the side. Like, she's just a woman of endless projects. So she is, I think, fully retired at this point from programming and is focusing on doing real estate more for fun than anything else. And I talked to her recently, and she said that she's realizing how a lot of the people who lived through the Cultural Revolution, which was a historical and really important time in China's story, are slowly dying off. And it's important to maintain those narratives. And how wonderful would it be if she could capture some of those stories for herself from her parents' generation and beyond, while we still had opportunity. My father, true to his principles, became an immigration lawyer. So he went to law school around the time that I was in law school, and opened up his own shop in Chinatown, because he was very acutely aware of how many immigration lawyers out there are taking money from immigrants and disappearing or just not doing the job. And that's what I didn't know as a child, that my parents had given money to an immigration lawyer after immigration lawyer, and they would just disappear until they were just afraid to trust that system again. So my father wanted to be that person for the community out there. And he goes to work every single day, doesn't miss a single day, because if there's one day of the week he's not there, he's concerned that his clients will think he disappeared. And he doesn't want them to worry about that on top of everything else for nothing. My father, unfortunately, has COPD. His lifespan is going to be a little bit shortened, and all of us are grappling with that. It's been a really long and difficult process of acceptance for us. He's in the later stages. So I am hopeful that I can capture some of his stories, some more of his stories at least, while we have the time to do so.
Can you share what your Hebrew name is and how you chose that name?
My Hebrew name is Hadassah, which is the other name for Esther. And when I came upon this name, I thought how wonderful that even in Judaism, I should have two versions and two names. Hadassah representing kind of hiddenness, but also the myrtle tree and a sense of wisdom from that tree. and everything that Esther represents in Jewish traditions and the Purim holiday, tied very closely to how I would like to live my life as a woman, the sense of Hadassah being at the core of Jewish feminism, of fighting for rights, fighting for our voice to be heard. It just tied so naturally to who I see myself and who I aspire to be. So if I had my druthers, I would go by Qian Julie Hadassah, but that's a lot of syllables.
A lot of
I don't
names.
think anybody, I don't think anybody would quite sign on for that, but it is a name I cherish and hold very dear.
You mentioned earlier that you connected with a lot of books that were Jewish growing up. Is there any particular one that really resonated with you?
Yeah, so the Diary of Anne Frank stays with me to this day. I mentioned that growing up, it was hard to find books that reflected my world and my everyday. And it's not like, I lived through the Holocaust or anything as horrific as Anne had to see. But there was something about reading about a little girl who had to hide who she was and literally hide herself. And something about seeing in print and literature a little girl whose identity made her illegal. That was really validating for me, and I didn't know how badly I needed it until that book was assigned to me in class. Seeing how much my classmates loved her, how much my classmates related to her, showed me that maybe I wasn't so unacceptable either, just because I was illegitimate under the law. Didn't mean that I couldn't be lovable, and didn't mean that I couldn't myself fixate on things like cats or boys and crushes like Anne did. What I found to be so magical about Anne's diary was that despite all the horrors, she held on to the center of love and faith and humanity and hope in this magical way that in turn gave me hope. If she could have that through what she lived through, then I had no excuse, right? I had no excuse to not believe in the goodness of the people around me.
Mm-hmm. Have you and your family ever had a chance to go back to China?
Yes, we've been back a few times. I have been trying to go back since late 2019. I got married in late 2019. And two of my grandparents are still there and alive, but the pandemic has made it near impossible. So I'm hoping to go back at the next opportunity. But every time I do return, it feels like a piece of myself is locked up there. I'm just a little bit more raw and emotional. People say that you're more logical and reasoned in your second language. And I think part of that seeps into how I am in America. I'm just a little bit more contained and in control here. And once I'm back in China, I think it comes back to me how I was a little girl who was unfiltered and not worried about anything and just kind of running through the world with an open heart. And I'm able to reclaim a little bit of that when I'm back there. So I look forward to returning as soon as I can and connecting with that part of myself a little bit.
You mentioned in the book that you had wonderful teachers, but you also had a few teachers that were not so wonderful. And you talked specifically about one teacher who didn't believe you when you handed in something that was very well written and couldn't fathom that you were the one who wrote that. How did that impact you? And what is your message to teachers today who have, I'm sure many, many teachers have students in the class that were like you? And what do you say to them today?
So unfortunately, that was not the only time in my life that happened. It continued to happen in junior high school. And even as I was a practicing lawyer, my supervisor called me in and said there was no way you could have written a brief this good. I was an immigrant. This was a person who had seen me argue in a courtroom, right? Knew that I spoke English.
Knew that you went to Yale.
Yeah. Well, all that besides. It really, that first experience, because I just really did not expect it. And no one really expects it, but once it's happened to you like 4 times, you come to kind of accept, I guess, that this is how the world sees you. But that first time cut me to the core. It reminded me that who I was inside did not align with what was outside. And because children don't want to get in trouble, they don't want to be called in to that discussion with their teacher, I had to hide myself. I learned to put mistakes in intentionally so that he wouldn't doubt me again. I learned to limit myself. And that limit, that self-limit, I think stayed with me for a very long time. Every time I handed anything in school, I would think, is this too good? Should I go back and delete some things and just make some typos? Because I don't want to have that conversation. I think that when you limit a child's perception of her own greatness, her own capabilities like that early on, it stays with them. And I think that probably many of us can think of a time when we were told, either in action or words, to make ourselves a little bit smaller. And life is too short for that. Life is meant to be lived as largely and as grandly as we possibly can fathom. And I regret that I let one teacher shape me into that little tiny box. Wish I could take some of those years back, but it's never too late. And so I hope that any teachers out there who are listening, I mean, your job, you are a hero, first and foremost. Your job is incredibly difficult and you do not get nearly enough credit for what you do. And you probably don't need to hear this from me, but your words and your actions will resonate in your students' minds forever. They will shape them in the direction their lives take. And I'm sure you know that. But with that comes the positive influences and the negative. And so the ways in which you are expressing limits to your students, that will shape the trajectory of their careers and their lives. And with great power comes great responsibility, as Spider-Man says. So.
Well, we're coming to an end, and I'm sorry we can't get to more questions, but we'll end with a few questions about what's next. Your book has spanned your childhood, and people want to know if you're going to be sharing the second half of coming back to the United States, getting into college, law firm, all of that stuff. Will you be sharing that with people?
I'm working on a novel right now. I probably will write a second memoir at some point down the line, but I think the importance of memoir is perspective. And I don't think I've had enough time to process the years that came later. I think I need a little bit more space and processing to really find insight in those years to come, but that will definitely be in the works down the line.
Mm-hmm. And the other question was, any thoughts on a children's book, whether it is about your life story or Jews of color, anything like that?
Yeah, I have been kicking around a lot of those ideas. It's been a while since I've looked at a picture book. So I recently went out and bought a ton, and oh my God, there's so many options now. You know, so many options just for the Jewish community alone and the Chinese community. It's just like every child can find themselves reflected in a book now, and what a wonder that is. So I've been kind of reacclimating myself to that world and the language used, and hopefully I can work toward a few books on that front as well.
And you're continuing to practice law, correct? Right?
Yes.
Just your day job. Anyway, Qian Julie, thank you so much for sharing with the Moment audience. I want to thank Sarah Breger for spending the time with us as well. I want to remind everybody to go to momentmag.com, where you can sign up for next week's program about anti-Semitism in Hungary. Earlier, I put a link in the chat to her book, Beautiful Country, and I will send out an email later this week that will also include a link to this recording as well as to the book. Thank you again, and we hope to see everybody next time.
Thank you. So wonderful to start off 5783 with you all.
Thank you. Shana Tova. Bye-bye.
Shana Tova.